Welcome, everyone. Appreciate you joining. Again, please use the chat function to network with each other. That's one of the beauties of these webinars, is that we don't just want you to come listen and leave, but also use it as a platform to get to know each other, partner, team up, talk about opportunities, work with each other here in the future. So please use the chat function to network. Share your company name, your contact information, and if you're looking for specific teaming partners surrounding any of either this topic or some other opportunity, this is your opportunity to do that in the chat box. I will be using the Q&A channel to monitor questions from the audience. So please don't submit questions in the chat box. I might miss them, and I don't want to. With that, well, welcome to our very hot discussion and a topic that is sometimes seems overdone, but very critical and important. We're going to demystify CMMC. We're going to talk nuts and bolts and give our team of experts from Secure Structs is going to give us very specific tips on what your companies can do to get started in the right direction. We don't have to wait for the government to make this a rule and mandate it on us. It's a good thing to have clean cyber hygiene. It helps our companies. It helps us be competitive and secure. And so we want to do what is the right thing anyways, but how do we go about doing it? That's what we're going to learn. So I'm excited to bring our team. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Reena, and I'm the CEO of Proposal Helper and Bid Execs. We've been in business for about 14 years now, and I've been in the industry for 30 years, and I worked both U.S. federal markets and overseas. U.S. businesses doing global business and doing business with international governments. We just launched our Bid Execs India brand. So we're now also, we have our flagship Asia office out of India. Excited about the growth of that region. I hold a master's degree from University of Maryland, College Park. So any of my fellow alumni out there, shout out. And Trine University out in, if anyone can find this on the map, Angola, Indiana. So excited to be here. Looking forward to this discussion. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Nathan. Nathan, over to you. Let's learn all about Secure Structs and your team.
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, perhaps good morning, depending where you're called in from. Thank you, Renee and Proposal Helpers, for having us today to just share in our experience. As Rita said, my name is Nathan Shea, and I'm very glad that we can be with you for this short period of time. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I just wanted to give a quick introduction to Secure Structs and my background, and then I'm going to hand it over to Justin Sylvester and Matt Pagan, who will be providing the bulk of this presentation and speaking to our experience and what it took for us to prepare for our own CMMC audit. I started Secure Structs a little over 10 years ago. I live here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where our offices are headquartered, right there in between Philly and Harrisburg, if you're familiar with the area. Our team is comprised of about 45 members and cyber experts who are scattered throughout the country. Cybersecurity is pretty much all that we eat, drink, and sleep, and many of us have been supporting the DoD and its supply chain for almost 2 decades now. Personally and originally as a company, we started out supporting DISA, performing and leading command cyber readiness inspections, also known as CCRIs, to anyone that was connected to the SIPRNet, which included many of the defense contractors as well. Over time, as we know, all defense contractors, not just the clear defense community, were levied with more and more compliance requirements. In 2017, when CUI requirements were required to start using the NIST 800-171 to come, when they started coming into play, we began supporting really all defense contractors. So our primary lines of business are CCRI support, RMF, and CMMC preparation and engineering support. We also do quite a bit of work doing pen testing and cloud security and engineering. That's been a good piece of our business more recently. Since 2020, as many of you know, the CMMC as a framework was born and has slowly matured and rolled out, which, as we all know, has caused an extra requirement and burden for businesses that do work for the DoD. Since 2017, when CUI compliance became a requirement, we have supported over 100 companies with their CUI and CMMC preparation, including ourselves. A little under a year ago, we had to eat our own dog food, so to speak, with DCMA coming out and assessing our own environment so that we could be certified as a certified third-party assessing organization, also known as a C3PAO. Our hope today is to pass along what we did to prepare, provide some lessons learned, and hopefully make your journey, if you haven't started it yet, a little easier as you get ready for your own certification. So with that, I'm going to ask Justin to introduce himself, and then Matt to do the same, and then lead us in to today's presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. And good afternoon / good morning, everyone. My name's Justin Sylvester. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer here at Secure Structs. I also manage the engineering line of our consulting services. I've been in the, working with the defense contractors and the DoD now for just over 12 years. Started out at General Dynamics Land Systems and moved over to Secure Structs. So thank you all for the opportunity to present to you. I'm looking forward to working with Matt through the presentation here.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Matthew Pagan here. I am our CMMC lead here at Secure Structs. And I've been working with CMMC in 2017 when they started to kick the can down the road, for lack of better terms. I am a certified CMMC assessor, certified CMMC professional, and I'm really looking forward to giving you guys a little bit of my 2 cents today during this presentation. So ready to get started.
Well, thank you for the introductions. I'm going to hand it right back over to you guys to go through your presentation.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, so for today, we're going to be going through quite a few items. We're going to start at the top of talking about CMMC, what it's about, some of the requirements surrounding CMMC. Then we're going to talk about a little bit of what you need to do as a personal company or, a small business all the way up into a medium to high level business of creating that compliance roadmap, implementing some of the security controls, all of the documentation that really surrounds the CMMC program. And then at the very end, we're going to close and then talk about some of our own experiences and how Nate and Justin had a lot of fun during their DIPCAC assessment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a question I get a lot. What is CUI? Why is CUI a thing? Why is CMMC a thing? And I'll tell you, it really starts from 2009, during the Obama presidency, where he initiated the Executive Order 13556. This initiated the classification of controlled unclassified information. The reason this became a thing was because of our near-peer adversaries were getting so good at collecting information from us that they were able to collect all the information and then build something out of that. So for example, if you collect enough unclassified information, you can essentially bring all that information up to a secret or even a top secret level. And that's how some of our near-peer adversaries got so good at creating some of our technologies that were flowing through our defense industrial base. Even though some of those technologies might be very simple, such as nuts and bolts, it can range all the way until processors and some really cool gizmos and gadgets. If you can put enough of those together, usually you can build something pretty cool. And so from that, we created Executive Order 13556, where we initiated creating controlled and classified information as a classification data. And then we created the need to create NIST 800-171 to control that data. So NIST 800-171 came out of that executive order to create all the controls surrounding controlling that data. Along with that, some assessment requirements came out of this to make sure that, hey, whenever you're inputting your SPURS score, whenever you're making sure that you're covering this data, that we're assessing properly and we're making sure that these controls are indeed in place. From that, CMMC was created because there are different other classifications of data, such as FCI, CUI, and ITAR data. So CMMC came about as almost a maturity model, so that you can cover certain parts of that 800-171. So next slide, please. I'll talk about this timeline. So this is the CMMC model. As you see, you have level 1, 2, and 3. And you might have noticed, hey, this might be a little bit different from what I used to, because in 2021, they created CMMC model 1.0, and they changed over to the CMMC model 2.0. So your level 1 focuses heavily on your FCI data. That's your federal contract information. That's going to be the budgeting, the people who are going to give you that CUI data, who you're working with in the government. And then your level 2 is going to be specifically that CUI data that you're going to be covering. And that's going to be your full 110 controls. And that's majority of what we see within the defense industrial base right now, is a lot of people and companies are needing to be covered with level 2. Level 3, which hasn't quite been solidified just yet, is going to be basically your ITAR and your export control data. And so another question I get is, they have been kicking the can down the road quite some time for CMMC. And when is it actually going to be implemented? Well, early this year, we did get a proposed rule that almost solidifies what we're going to be doing for CMMC, such as all of the ins and outs of the program, but also some of the assessment requirements. From that proposed rule, my colleagues and I created a bunch of comments through that proposed rule, so that the final rule can come out and we can actually solidify and quit kicking the can down the road. This final rule is supposed to come out in Q4 of 2024 and or Q1 of 2025. So really excited to see what that looks like whenever we get all of the comments in and the proposed rule fleshes out to a final rule. Next slide, please. All right, so what do we need to do to become CMMC compliant? Next slide. The most important thing that I see as an assessor is whenever I go into an assessment, I notice that either our scope is way too big or the scope is way too small. The scope is really going to determine the boundaries of where your CUI is stored, processed, and exchanged. And this can be any kind of technical implementation, but it can also be the employees that are handling that CUI. So if it's not done right, if your scoping is way too big, way too small, it can be really hard to nail down where we're storing, processing, exchanging this CUI. And thus it makes it really hard to protect that CUI. So the most important thing is to understand your CUI, understand its marking requirements, understanding where it lives externally, where it's being sent externally. Let's look at those controls. Let's learn how to isolate your CUI and to protect that CUI. There's a really cool document on the DoD CIO website that is a CMMC scoping guide. And it'll give you all the ins and outs on what you need to do to make sure that your scope can be as small as possible, so we have less to assess and you have more success during your assessment. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think some of the first questions that you really need to ask is, do all employees really need to handle CUI? Do our marketing people probably need to handle CUI? Maybe not. Or HR? Possibly not. So we really need to figure out that subset of employees that are going to be handling CUI. And usually this is going to be, our engineers or the people that are actually working on those contracts. So we need to make sure that that CUI is isolated so we can essentially bring those employees out of scope. And like I said earlier, if scoping is not done accurately, if it's not done properly, potentially your entire network or your entire company could be in scope. And I think Nate and Justin have something to say about that. But I will say, consider developing that secure enclave for protection of your CUI. Go ahead.
Yeah, just just a little bit from our own experience. When we started this pretty early on, I would say it was like the 21, 22 time frame where we were like, all right, we want to, be in front of this tip of the spear and get ourselves in a good place so that we can, when we do get audited, we can fly with passing colors. And when we started doing this, we explored, we were already in Office 365 environment in the commercial side. And we decided, hey, you know what, instead of us like messing up with maybe mishandling CUI, let's just all go into GCC High, the entire company, the entire environment. And, we thought that was a good idea. Doesn't scale very well as you grow. Those licenses are pretty expensive. And like Matthew said, there's just, there's a lot of departments within our company and most companies that don't handle CUI. So not really a need. And so as we went down that path, probably a year and a half into, we're like, this doesn't scale, this doesn't seem right. And as we learned and got smarter, we made a decision to really just sandbox our CUI and our environment. And so we did some, we backtracked a little bit, took our licenses, minimized them to just the users and the pieces that would be CUI. And Justin's going to talk a little bit about the technical implementation at a high level, but we took most of our users out of that environment and put them back into our commercial environment, saving us a ton of money and some headache as well. We had two environments that we had to manage. We had our commercial environment, and then we had our GCC High environment we had to manage versus just having that one environment. But from a pricing standpoint, from just an assessment standpoint, almost more importantly, a lot of things came out of scope. A lot of our HR software, accounting software, all of those things just were removed out of the environment, and we just put in that environment exactly what we needed to do our work and to support our clients. So that was a lesson learned for us from spending a lot of money up front to migrate over and then also migrating back. A lot of time spent in labor to do that. Ultimately, we feel like we got that right and got a small environment. So whenever the DIDCAC did come out and do our assessment, it was a very quick assessment. And it also allowed us to, from those lessons learned, be able to share this with you today and other clients as well. Like, here's a best practice and here's where we messed up. So that was our little bit of a journey whenever we went through the scoping process and where we messed up, but learn from it. So.
Yeah, Nate, I think you did an excellent job there communicating the lessons learned that we had. What I'll say is that when we went through this process ourselves, it was pretty amazing how many users actually didn't require access to that secure enclave or the scoped CUI environment, right? So I would say, one of the lessons learned is just make sure that the people that you are signing access need access, and ensure, that the environment that you have has the basics that really are required for it to function and nothing more. So two lessons learned there through scoping our enclave.
I almost like to equate CMMC and creating the enclave to the equivalency of making a SCIF, but pertaining to those 800-171 controls. So if anybody here is familiar with the secret level environments or top secret level environments, creating that SCIF and then having your employees as a need to know. So you don't really want your whole company to be a SCIF because that's really expensive and it can really expand your budget. And so if you can narrow it down just to a subset of your network and those employees who actually have the need to know and do need the need to know, then you can really narrow down that scope and that budget. So if you think of it almost like a SCIF, that helps put it into a little bit more perspective for me and my clients. Okay. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Okay. Implementing the requirements of CMMC. So I'm sure if anybody here has read through some of the 800-171 controls, you'll notice that not all CMMC practices are technical. And a lot of the practices will require direction input from non-technical team members, such as there are some HR controls for, exit interviews and interview and properly make sure that some of the employees are U.S. citizens, or marketing controls to make sure that you don't post FCI or CUI on publicly accessible databases or LinkedIn or anything like that. And so all of the CMMC practices will need to be met before an official assessment begins. So whenever you go for your official assessment, you need to have in the SPIRT system 110 out of 110, need to have an SSP in there. You need to make sure that we're technically and procedurally proficient within that system, and to make sure we have everything in place. And so experience has shown that implementation of technical controls is the easy part of CMMC. The documentation side of the house is going to be the biggest uplift if we're able to scope properly. Without proper scoping, that technical piece can be pretty tricky. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, you will need to have all of your 110 practices of CMMC met before you go to that assessment. But I did want to mention, there are 110 practices, but if you do look in the assessment guide on the DoD CIO website, you'll notice that there is an assessment objective or multiple assessment objectives associated with each one of those practices. And so I almost like to say, yes, there is 110 practices, but there are 320 assessment objectives that you need to meet. And so you do need to meet every single one of those 320 assessment objectives under those practices to be able to be proficient. And so, like I said, it's recommended. Go check out that CMMC assessment guide. It'll give you all the ins and outs of those assessment objectives following those practices. And Justin, I think you had something.
Yeah, Matt. Yeah, thanks. I'll say that in working with clients and just talking to people about this framework and this model, right? I think this piece is something that is often overlooked, right? Everybody sees NIST 800-171 as 110 security controls that you have to implement, but really those security controls are broken down into individual objectives. So it's, it's not as heavy of a lift as implementing something like NIST 800-53, but it is a little bit misleading when we talk about 110 practices really translate into the implementation of 320 things, whether that be, defining certain variables for your organization or implementing the technical security controls for those practices. So just something I wanted to touch on there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next slide, please.
And before I move, I just want the audience to know we are recording this call and slides and recording will be shared. A couple of questions in the Q&A about this. Yes, we are recording. We'll share the slides.
Hey, Matt, before we move on to developing documentation, which, as you said, is the heaviest lift, I wanted to give a little bit of background about how we kind of scoped our environment and how we implemented our technical security controls. So, as Nate said, we migrated we were all in GCC High. We migrated back from GCC High, and we built a virtual enclave there. So, to implement the majority of our security controls, it's a cloud-based system. We're using Azure Virtual Desktop, a virtualized environment to allow folks to remotely connect and then operate within a secure cloud enclave. So all of the technical security controls, the CUI that we work with, it all lives inside of that enclave. It cannot leave that enclave. It's only accessible through those remote connections to those secure virtual instances. And that's kind of the approach that we took to scoping our environment. Matt, I'll let you touch on developing documentation, which, again, as he said, was the most time-consuming part for us.
Very much so.
And since we've landed here, I'll just mention too, like us virtualizing that environment was probably one of the more difficult things, but also from a longevity and resilience, one of the best decisions that we made. We don't have to worry about laptop configuration. We don't have to worry about having a secure network or a secure computer necessarily. It's the image that we are really concerned about, and not allowing data tagging. All of our data had to be tagged so that we knew what was CUI versus not CUI. We had to have separate domain or separate email addresses as well. And so there was a lot of preparation in the background, but once it was done, that and the environment was set up correctly, the longevity of the technology allows us to not have to spend a ton of time on the maintenance side of things. So it was difficult, but it was the right decision moving forward, going into that remote desktop environment, as you will.
Okay, system security plan. So I'm sure you guys have heard of this. It's something that's very needed within the CMMC program. And in fact, you need it to be able to put in your SPUR score for those contracts. However, I like to think of the system security plan as an end-all, be-all, sole source of truth for your internal CMMC program. So at a high level, it's going to describe how exactly are we meeting these security requirements and these security controls. So, an effective SSP, we're going to make use of those policies, procedures, any additional documentation. It's going to outline your QA data flow diagram. It might have your network diagram on there. It might have all of the artifacts that you need as one sole source of truth for your CMMC program. So me as an assessor coming in, this is one of the most important documents that I'm going to look at. And I can usually tell through my clients or the organization seeking certification on how effective we are within our CMMC program, just based looking right through the SSP. And we'll see, oftentimes I see where OSCs aren't quite meeting the requirement for SSP, which is 3.12.4, which we'll see on the next slide. But I do want to say, whenever you're writing through your SSP, make sure you go through the 5 W's and the how. Whenever you're writing to meet those assessment objectives and those controls, let's make sure we use as much verbiage as possible so that I don't have to question as an assessor whether we're meeting that control or not. And a good rule of thumb to do that is to almost reiterate that assessment objective. So if it says define such and such, literally put a definition in there, or if it says specify the number of generations before password reuse, reiterate that within your SSP. That way there's no question, ifs, ands, or buts of how we're meeting this control. As I mentioned before, SSP is a prerequisite for calculating and submitting a SPUR score. So this is definitely something that we need to have. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, 3.12.4, this is going to outline your requirements for your SSP. You can see it's quite extensive as we have 8 assessment objectives here. So good rule of thumb, go through these assessment objectives. Let's make sure that we're meeting each and every single one of them. A lot of times we see SSPs that don't meet the intent. There are some compliance organizations out there or organizations who sell templates that don't have SSPs that meet the requirement. So I'll make sure you go through these assessment objectives. Let's make sure we have everything that we need in there, and then make sure it's signed into place by your senior management and or CEO, depending on how big the organization may be. The SSP is a living document, so make sure as you're upgrading some of the systems, you're changing some of the policies and procedures, so on and so forth, that we continue to update this document as it's a sole source of truth for your CMMC program. Okay. Next slide, please. Roles and responsibilities. Okay, so this is something big within the CMMC program, because if we're monitoring our controls or if we're implementing these controls, someone needs to be responsible for the implementation of these controls and or managing these controls. And so something that's really nice to have and something that assessors love to look at is when you develop a roles and responsibility matrix that clearly identifies those roles and responsibilities for each in every single CMMC practice. So it's almost like you have an owner for each control and or subject matter expert. And we do see this document a lot of times within smaller businesses where either your MSP might have a subject matter expert to cover some of these controls, which will go into a shared responsibility matrix, or because the organization isn't so big, we might have multiple employees covering multiple controls, and that's totally fine as long as we have it mapped out to who's covering what and how we're managing that on whatever basis or whatever frequency to make sure that it's continuously implemented. And so, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Matt. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yep. We will use this document during your assessment to figure out who to interview. And so as I'm going through an assessment, an official audit, there's 3 ways where I can audit some of the controls, but I only need 2 of them. So I need an interview, I need to examine the control, or I can test the control. And so this document is really crucial because it allows me to know exactly who I need to interview for this control. And then my examine can be, of course, going through the policies and procedures or your SSP or some follow-on documentation. And a test would be you showing me how you're actually implementing this control. And Justin, you had something?
Yeah, man. I think this is important from an assessor's perspective. I also think it's important from the internal organization's perspective, right? Because when you assign ownership to somebody, then you have somebody to hold accountable for those practices. So for us internally here, right, we implemented all of the security controls that we needed to for NIST 800-171, and then we signed ownership. And what that meant was those individuals were responsible for developing the processes and procedures around those security controls, and they were responsible for the continuous monitoring of those controls. So I think it's definitely a benefit to have this for an assessment, but also contributes internally to your success.
Okay, Rena, it looks like we have some questions. Do we want to wait till the end, or do we want to go ahead and answer a few of these questions?
Yeah, I mean, look, you're seeing the questions. If it pertains and you think it's relevant to address it now, please feel free to do that.
Okay. As far as the terms assessment and assessor, the same process as the final accreditor certifier, yes, I am referring to that. So whenever I go into an official audit, these are the certain things that I look for. As a consultant capacity, I'm going to be working with my clients to build them up to that level. But as far as this, I'm talking about an official assessment or an assessor in an official capacity. Yes. Hopefully that answered your question. As far as pushing to move to a GCC high, are there ways around staying in this environment for a commercial environment? You can use GCC high. It is a great tool. It's very expensive. It can be very expensive, especially for smaller businesses. As an assessor, if I come into your organization and I see that you're using GCC high, I have a very high level of confidence that you are technically covering these controls. And so it's a very big thumbs up. However, there are ways around staying into a commercial environment. There are such programs such as Prevail out there who you can use with your commercial environment. Or there's certain other things like Kiteworks that you can use, which would store your information outside of SharePoint in a different repository or a different enclave, and then it will encrypt it along the way. However, it really depends on the scope of your company, how much risk you're willing to burden, and what your budget looks like. So there are ways to do it. You're going to have to shop around, see what other options are out there. But as an assessor, me coming in, being very familiar with Microsoft and their tools, GCC High is the way to go for an easy and smooth assessment.
All right, and for those of us who are not familiar with what is GCC High, define it, please.
Yep, so GCC High is the government commercial cloud, high level for Microsoft. And so think about your Office 365, where you have, your Exchange, your mail servers, your PowerPoint, all of your cool gizmos and gadgets from Microsoft. It essentially turns it into the government version where all of the data is hosted within the United States. by U.S. citizens. And so that's why it's so important for CMMC, because we do have a requirement for all of the data to be hosted and handled and processed by U.S. citizens. And that also comes with a really pretty price point. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, well, we can continue and then take more questions later.
Yeah,
Okay.
Matt, real quick too. I think it does too depend on the type of information you have, right? If you have ITAR, if you have, trade control information, I believe that it has to be an environment equivalent to GCC high. If you're not working with that type of information, then I think there are other options for you, but it all really depends on what the provider, what the third party is providing in terms of security around that information.
Yes. All right, policies and procedures. This is a big uplift that we see within CMMC. It's a very important thing that we need to have. And so, of course, we need policies and procedures for to cover each CMMC practice. It really facilitates the understanding to achieve the clarification, to achieve obtaining the evidence necessary to meet some of these controls. And in fact, you'll see some of these controls which will specifically call out having a procedure, such as controlling public information 3.1.22. Assessment objective B says you have procedures to ensure FCI is not posted or processed. So while some controls do specifically call out a procedure, I do like to see as an assessor that we have some sort of procedures for most of the controls to make sure that we're continually implementing the technical aspect and the procedural aspect of those controls. So me as a brand new employee coming into your organization, I should be able to pick up something, a how-to, a wiki, to see, okay, this is how we're implementing CMMC. This is what buttons I need to push, so on and so forth. And so as we're assessing the CMMC program, 800-171 does assume that policies and procedures for your organization are already in place. So it's a very good thing to have whenever we're going through that assessment, to show that other extra breadth of evidence to cover these controls. Next slide, please. All right. So as I mentioned before, is a very big uplift for a lot of our organizations, our OSCs. It tends to be the weak link for the organizations because it can be very time intensive. So what we do see is oftentimes there is a very good lack of policies and procedures, or they become very old policies and procedures where they don't really pertain to the environment anymore, or the current processes that we are doing. And so beware of, copying and pasting a lot of procedures. Let's make sure that they don't become shelfware. And we also need to make sure that our policies and procedures are signed in place by that senior level management. As an assessor, if I'm coming in to assess your environment and I see that a policy is not signed in place by a senior level manager, I can't exactly take that policy. We need to have it make sure that it is actually effective and then it is implemented into place. Next slide, please. Let's make sure that we have one of our subject matter experts responsible for producing these procedures to make sure that they're as accurate as possible and to meet the applicable policies that we have for some of these controls. The owner of the policies need to make sure that we review and update as required. Again, let's make sure that we don't let these procedures become shelfware. If they're old, and let's say it's 3 years old and I come into an assessment, while some of that information may be okay, it is a good rule of thumb that whenever you go to your assessment, let's re-sign those procedures into place. That way we have something brand new. It's been reviewed, it's been looked over, it's fresh on the mind. And at the very end, if we're making the procedures, let's make sure that we follow the procedures. Justin, you have something there?
Yeah. During our inspection, prior to our inspection, it was requested that we provide all the documentation that had applied to our environment, the environment that we had scoped out. And the assessors, in going through the assessment, wanted to make sure that we understood our processes, that the owners of the security controls that we had identified in our responsibility matrix understood the process. And as Matt said, testing is one of the methods that assessors will use to ensure that you're meeting security control objectives. So they wanted us to kind of walk them through certain processes, and they would map those back to the documents that we had provided them to make sure that we understood them, and they weren't just, as Matt said, shelfware or just kind of checking the box. So a super important aspect of becoming certified, right, is ensuring that you have these policies and procedures defined, that they're thorough, and that your team is able to work through them.
Yeah. So beginning, when we scoped it, not as difficult, but incredibly important and critical that you scope your environment right. Next thing was actually implementing these controls, setting up our environment, difficult to do. And we spent a lot of time, making sure that, each piece of the equation for these systems were set up properly for the network, for the different pieces of our enclave. And then the last part here that we're talking about, these policies and procedures, then we had to discuss how are we meeting these controls. And this is where we got into, dotting I's, crossing T's, and had to spend a lot of time. And this is that living, breathing part of the equation, where if you change the environment slightly or upgrade or change the way you're going to do something, or the roles and responsibilities, these pieces constantly have to be or frequently reviewed and evaluated to make sure that you're like Matt was saying, it's not shelfware, but it becomes operationalized.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, when we were talking about roles and responsibilities and creating that roles and responsibility matrix, there's a second side of that. And so usually when I'm going through an assessment or talking with any company about getting CMMC certified, usually we're going to use an MSP, or we're going to use some kind of cloud service provider such as GCC High. It's just it's something that's very commonplace within the market right now. The one thing that I don't see very often is having that shared responsibility matrix. So what this is going to do is it's going to outline, just like your roles and responsibility matrix or your roles and responsibilities, it's going to show who is responsible for these specific controls. And so what we like to see is, because not only are we assessing you, we're also assessing who your provider is to make sure we are technically implementing these controls, is to make sure who is implementing the controls. And so let's say we have Microsoft GCC High, such as Secure Structs. Microsoft has this really awesome Excel file that outlines everything that they cover, how they technically implement it. Microsoft has been tried and true over time. And so me as an assessor coming in, knowing that you have GCC High, seeing what you have implemented, looking at your placemat, I know for a fact, hey, we are covering these controls. That might not be the same as if you're using a really small town MSP, which is not a bad thing, but we do need to make sure, if we're going for our CMMC program, we need to make sure that MSP, that managed service provider, provides us with a shared responsibility matrix so that we can ensure, hey, they're technically covering those controls for you as you're inheriting those controls. And next slide, please. Closing and lessons learned. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so please remember, CMMC is still a maturity model. One aspect of maturity comes with operationalizing. It's a crawl, walk, run. You don't want to just jump straight in there and start running with it, and that's how Secure Structs made some of the mistakes we did back then. Putting the whole company in scope and then having to narrow it down, which is very common. But during your assessment, your CMMC assessment, there will be an expectation for you to prove that you're doing the job that says in the SSP. And so that's why we need to make sure that we have those policies and procedures set on the side, our SSP set on the side, so that we can prove, hey, we are implementing these controls. Once your preparation is done, once we properly scope the environment, once we properly are implementing, let's operationalize this thing. And how do we do this? Well, we're going to rehearse. Make sure you rehearse your CMMC assessment. Whoever is responsible for those certain controls, we need to make sure that they know what they're doing for their job. And I get this question a lot. Can I have my policies and procedures? Can I have my SSP next to me while I'm getting assessed? Yes, please reference those documents while you're getting assessed. Our job as an assessor is not to go in and to fail you. Our job is to pass you. And so the more evidence you come with me or come to me with, the more easier of a time I'm going to have to put that stamp of approval on your assessment. Please consider holding a mock CMMC assessment just like you would. Maybe do a tabletop exercise. Let's go through it just a few times to make sure. And again, do not let your CMMC documentation become shelfware. Always update it, always review it, make sure it's signed in place and ready to go. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about our timeline at the beginning. So we are in the CMMC 2.0 phase. We have the proposed rollout. My colleagues have went through. We have made some comments. The final rule is coming. It's going to come. It's going to take anywhere from 8 to 18 months before it's fully prepared and before it is fully out there. So we are expecting between Q4 of 2024 and Q1 of 2025. And so, hey, let's make sure that we're starting with CMMC now. We don't want to be too late, because when that final rule does come out, there is going to be a short rollout period that we're expecting from the DoD CIO. But we do want to make sure, hey, if this is in our contract, we do want to be ready to accept those contracts and to accept that CUI data from the government or CUI data from the government. It is recommended that contractors work with independent consultants such as SecureStructs, and there's also plenty of other companies out there, RPOs and C3POs to work with to get you up to the compliance level that you need to be. And please, whenever you're going through your formal assessment, or if you're going through any assessment for CMMC, make sure you read through this 800-171 controls. Make sure you know the requirements. Know where your CUI is at. Document your CUI. Make sure it's marked. Isolate it and protect it within your CMMC program. And then always make sure you're improving your cybersecurity posture. Cybersecurity is something that is becoming more mainstream in our world today. I'm sure you guys have seen lately where some casinos have been getting hacked, and China continues to steal some of our information and creating really cool technologies. So please continue to make sure that we are improving our cybersecurity posture. And Nate and Justin, I'm going to turn it over to you for some lessons learned there and onto the questions.
Yeah, I know. Go ahead, Justin, if you want. I'm just from a business standpoint, my hands were not in the weeds and turning the knobs and getting greasy and anything like that. I really we had to have some smart folks around us to support that. But like we've seen, not just with CMMC, which is a maturity model, it is maturing. I doubt it will ever end. 800-171 version 2, version 3, version 4, version 5, whatever they get to, it continues to evolve to meet the needs of whatever's being presented to us by the adversary and new technologies and how to do that. Even with backing up to that shared responsibility matrix, you can deconfigure the way Microsoft has deployed their security settings. So it's really important that your file, even though it's being rolled out secure defaultly or certain aspects are being rolled out, to still be looking at those settings and making sure that they're configured properly and for the need to know. For me, the lessons learned was just to probably take a little bit more time in preparing. And also now I'm able to share with other business owners and other folks a quick 5-minute conversation on like, hey, setting up your environment is critical from the outset. It'll minimize the mistakes and the cost long term. But I know Justin's got plenty of lessons learned. He spent a lot of time developing our documentation and our environment, and and even doing some training. So
Yeah. Thanks, Nate. And I think we covered a lot of the lessons learned that we had as an organization throughout the presentation here. But one just additional thing I'll touch on. I think we're running low on time. We'll get to some questions here. One additional thing I wanted to touch on, and Nate kind of touched on it there, is simply moving to a secure cloud environment, right? Like GCC or GCC High, does not automatically make you compliant with the framework, right? There are a whole bunch of commercial or customer responsibilities that have to be implemented, that have to be monitored. Sure, you do inherit some of some security controls by existing within a secure cloud, but there's a lot that you have to keep an eye on. There's a lot that you have to continuously monitor. So just an important point there.
All right, looks like we do have
Yeah.
a few questions here.
Yeah, there are some
Yeah.
questions. There are some questions in the Q&A channel, but I'm sort of curious in my end. We talk a lot about China coming after us. Does China have an equivalent version of CMMC on their side?
Not that I'm aware of. I know they have some internal cybersecurity standards, but I don't think it's surrounding any kind of equivalent data type at the moment. Nate, Justin, do y'all have any clue about that?
Nah, I'm not. I would,
I
I would think there's some best practices.
Brazen of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sure there's some best practices that they take care of as well.
Yeah.
So
That would be an interesting thing to find out. And I want to ask a question that has not been posted. We get this quite a bit. What kind of companies should worry about CMMC? And I ask that because there are companies who do things like construction, or they're manufacturers, but they are supplying to the DoD. They're working on the installations, whether they're touching energy grids or what have you. Does this apply to all companies?
I can answer that one. Yes. So what you need to do is, if you're a company that does business with the DoD, you need to look in your contract and look for those DFARS clauses within your contract. If you have anywhere from a 7012 to a 7019 to a 7020, we need to make sure that we're starting to look at CMMC. It doesn't quite matter what you're providing for the government, because we have seen, the Bob's machine shops out there who do create nuts and bolts. And the government continues to send them technical specifications, and those technical specifications are CUI. It's under the classification of CTI, Controlled Technical Information. And so what I recommend is, hey, if you're currently doing business with the government, look at your current contracts. Let's make sure that we we have the correct DFARS clauses in there. If they're not in there, I would contact whoever, specifically whatever your customer is, and then talk about this subject, because eventually everybody who does business with the DoD will need to be CMMC compliant if you're providing any parts, or I like to say gizmos and gadgets.
And there's a question around training, and I had a similar question from earlier. What is the best way to train your employees? It's good to have these policies, procedures, and practices in place, but employees change. How do you maintain it? What's the best way to train employees?
So for training, there are a few training platforms out there. The one that I recommend the most is CDSE. It has a mandatory CUI training. It has derivative marking for CUI, and then has your cyber awareness challenge. And so if I'm going to an assessment and I see, for 3.2.1, which is your awareness and training, hey, if we're training our employees on some of these specific trainings within CDSE, I have confidence that, hey, they know what to do with their CUI within the environment. As far as tracking, really what we're looking for, you can use a program such as KnowBe4 or some other learning management systems. But really, when it gets down to it, I just need to see some kind of evidence. If we have a folder for everybody that has their certificates in there, and then you have like an Excel file that shows that the employee did this, this, and this, that's good for me. I just need to see like, hey, they've done it, they've accomplished it, some kind of evidence.
And so you bring up a good point. Companies don't have to go out and spend money on new tools and technologies for this, but it's the practices, it's the good hygiene. And as long as you maintain records, it could be an Excel sheet, as long as you have maintained records that your employees have gone through the training and they're following it. You don't
Well,
need
also,
an expensive learning management system in place.
you'd be surprised how many controls that we can meet with a simple Excel file. So yeah,
Excellent.
I agree.
But
Yeah.
that's good news. I want your opinion on this. Since CMMC has not become a rule yet, we get contractors asking us, is it worth getting ISO 27000 certified? Should we invest in that? What are your thoughts on that?
Nate, Justin, do y'all have any input?
Yeah, I mean, we've done both. They all cover a little bit different area. CMMC certainly applies the controls and gets into the nitty gritty. So there's different ones out there. I think CMMC is pretty robust. There's some other ones as well. So they all attack it from a different angle. And some contracts require it, and some, even if you don't have a contract that requires it, sometimes having, you know, multiple certifications, if you're going after certain contracts, it makes you a little more attractive. And it's the same with CMMC for us when we first got started. Is we didn't have a requirement to hold CUI at the time. We knew we would at some point, and so we wanted to lean forward into that and get certified and mature our environment. I also saw a question here, hey, can I be an independent consultant and an assessor or a certifier for the same company? And that is a no-go. We need to make sure there's a distinction there. And we really, our roots are in helping companies get ready and to assess, but we can't do both for the same client. So there's lots of, I think there's about 50 C3PAs out there, and a ton of consultants as well for the RPO side. If we're going to support anyone, our desire is to help them through the assessment and get them prepared for that official certification. But we will do both, but just not for the same client. So.
Okay, thank you for that. And I must say, proposal helpers and bid execs, we went through the ISO 27000 information security certification process, and then a self-assessment of ourselves against the CMMC requirements. And a lot of the policies and procedures we had prepared were helpful. So
Yeah.
there is an overlap, and it's helpful, but like you said, at some point there's more to CMMC than ISO has in there, but it was very useful because I think we were about, I would say 40 to 50% into it by the, you know, because of us having gone through the ISO certification.
Yeah. And they're moving quickly too, with this maturity process. Sometimes it's been a little bit of a crawl, but they're moving pretty quickly, and folks are going to have to do more than just do self-attestations, like for level 1, level 2, and level 3 you're going to require a third party to come out there and do that certification for you. So it's going to be more than just, hey, we're doing this.
Another reason for you all to get started sooner rather than later, because I think you said, there are only about 50 assessors out there?
Yeah, 50 certifiers right now, and I'm sure it'll grow over time, but there's there's just a bandwidth issue with the government and getting them certified, as well as doing the JSVAs, which are, they're trying to get some of the bigger organizations certified so that they can take on contracts. So.
All right, well.
Which is a different discussion, so.
Yes. All right, and Suzanne, thank you for being a lively audience member. I see tons of comments and questions from you. Appreciate that very much. I don't have any other questions here that I prepared to ask you. Is there anything that you would, closing remarks, anything that you'd like the audience to know? This was excellent. I appreciate you breaking it down and making it so simple versus all the mystery that surrounds CMMC. I'll let you give closing remarks. And again, if you want to share any contact information for people to reach out to you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rena. Appreciate you having us and proposal helpers as well. It's a real treat to be able to share our experience. It was tough. It wasn't easy, but we learned a ton. And this isn't rocket science. I know it can be a little overwhelming for the smaller shops that this might be new to them. For those that have been doing work with the DoD and having to comply with them, you can take a lot of what you've done already and transfer that over to the CUI environment. As Matt said earlier, the threat is real. They're taking all kinds of pieces of information and putting it together and using it to expand their technology very, very rapidly. What's taken us 35 years to build takes them about 2 or 3 years sometimes because they have all that hard work in front of them. So this is definitely long overdue. I would say 5 or 6 years ago, I'd have organizations come up to me and say, ask what we do. We tell them what they do, and they just look at us and say, "Well, I'm glad I don't have to do that." But the game has changed, and there's a lot of organizations right now that are working hard to become compliant. We're here to help if needed, and if you feel like you're ready, and we can start that conversation to do those official certifications, working obviously with GitCAC and CMMC. So again, Rena, appreciate it. Hope you all learned something today, got at least a nugget or two out of this, and trust you have a good week and good day.
Well, thank you all, appreciate it. And for the audience members, in the Q&A, I think there's an email address from Katie, bd@securestructs.com. Feel free to reach out to them. Our contact information has been shared in the chat box. Thank you all for attending. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.